Welcome to the Books Applied podcast, presented by WSL Leadership. In this podcast, we talk about an awesome book and how to apply it to your work, sport, or life. I'm your host, Iggy Perillo. Thanks for joining me. In today's episode, we'll be talking about the book Demystifying Disability, What to Know, What to Say, and How to Be an Ally by Emily Ladau. And I am talking today with the fabulous Lauren O'Malley. So excited to have you here, Lauren. Can you introduce yourself, Lauren, to the massive audience that we have listening throughout the universe? I'm just here to razz Lauren a little bit, but introduce yourself.
They're going wild. The crowd's going wild. I'm Lauren O'Malley. I have The Imperfect Network. I offer consultation and design and copywriting services for people who are looking for ethical, anti-capitalist, non-coercive marketing and communications.
That is awesome. And you also introduced me to this book. I forgot to tell you, I was going to ask you about this, but how did you come across this book in your world? How did this intersect with your life?
I was afraid you're going to ask me that. And it's such a straightforward question. And I honestly not entirely sure. I'm pretty sure it was through Twitter, which I still retain an affiliation with. And
okay.
I know, right? And I follow, as somebody who tries to be an ally, I follow a lot of different types of people there so that I can get some real insights. Maybe not the types that we think of when we think of Twitter, but more disability advocates and BIPOC advocates and things like that. So I think Emily sort of stumbled into my feed at some point, or I stumbled onto hers and became a huge fan. And really, her tweets were so great. And I actually wound up reaching out to her, and I read the book, or I read some of the book, and then I reached out to her and we had a nice little back and forth. And then she just got swept up into a level of fame that busyness that pulled her out of my immediate orbit, but still left me with this lovely book in my world.
That's awesome. That's great. Mm-hmm. That's such a great story. You're like, I know the author, and you're like, oh, fancy. So what did you think about this book? What did you like about this book, or what struck you as being useful or interesting?
My answer to that is everything, to all of those questions. What I love, the title kind of says it all, is demystifying disability, for one thing, is hugely important because it is a very sort of mystifying and mystical place for a lot of us. And then what to know, what to say, and how to be an ally. I think I'm not going to speak for everybody, but I can certainly speak for myself. And I think a lot of people, when I say that we're not really sure what to say or do, I think, in fact, when you and I met in a networking group, the third person in our little group said, just as we were leaving the group, he just got cut off just after he asked it, but he said, why don't we talk about disability more often? Mm-hmm, and it was such a great question. And this book sort of answers that question and so many others.
Yeah. I think it's really great because the definition of disability is sort of, you can't do things that you thought you could. And it could happen to anyone at any time. People have temporary disabilities, which I think, to me, I was like, oh, duh. Yeah, obviously people you break your leg, suddenly you're on crutches, disability. Mm-hmm. Or I was reading a little thing about someone who got a concussion. They couldn't, their brain, they could feel their memory not being as sharp. Disability. There are all these things that could happen to folks anytime. And I think there's this other weird sort of, I don't know what to say, this sort of weird popular view of disability, it means a wheelchair. And you're like, oh, actually, no. The demystifying part is the visible and the invisible disabilities, which I think is becoming more popular in the world, is that people just might not be, they might have a disability that we can't see or recognize in terms of how people process information, how people are able to take in information or share information, all these different sort of things, how people are able to move. We see someone, we're like, oh, they're just sitting there. Cool. We assume, I don't know what we assume. Everyone's like me, able-bodied, blah, blah, blah. And then that may not be the case, but we make a lot of assumptions based on sort of this general, I don't know. We assume people are like us. They might not be. Is my take on why we don't talk about disability, because I think we are not able to recognize it, not alone, let alone the ones that are not visibly obvious to folks.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting perspective. I've been giving that a lot of thought too, that question, and I think some of it is lack of sort of like not empathy, but experience, lived experience.
Mm-hmm.
Also fear. I think fear is a big part of it. We've been conditioned to believe that having a disability is an awful thing.
Right.
And oh my God, if that happened to me. So there's kind of this like, oh, I can't talk about it because that might make it closer to me and therefore possible for me. And I was thinking too about how so many of our understandings of interaction in the world are based on our very historical roots. So the fight or flight and all those sorts of things. And in which instance, a person with a disability would be a liability, right? Surviving under those circumstances would have been more complicated for somebody with a disability. And so it amazes me how little, when I think about it that way, I think of like how little we've evolved and how much more we need to evolve to include those things. And I totally agree that I'm glad you touched on the invisible disabilities, because I do believe that neurodivergence is something that's very commonly spoken about now on certain levels. ADHD is super popular, autism maybe not so much, so it's interesting how that's happening. But yeah, these are things that we can't assume that someone is not disabled, nor can we assume that someone is disabled. So my whole thing, again, thinking about talking to you about this book has been really helpful for me to really organize my thoughts around it. I think it's really important to approach everything with curiosity, empathy, and respect. So
absolutely.
That's how you be an ally. That's how you do.
End of story. That's it.
Right? Done. Okay. We're out.
Well, I think yes, 100%. And I'm glad that Emily Ladau wrote this book for the rest of us. We're like, should I say this or should I not say this? She kind of has charts, which are super sweet. And but the part that is I think the easiest is just the word disability is okay. You can say disability, just say disability. I'm like, oh, okay, good to know. And she goes through this very interesting tangent about person first language versus what's the other one? It's like ability first language or identity first language. Sorry. Yeah, person first or identity first. So person with blindness versus blind person, right? So the person is first versus the identity first. And she was very strong on her identity first side for a while. And then people are like, oh, why would you be person first? And people are very strong on the person first side. And she's like, well, ask the person. Like fundamentally, like you don't know if they, how people would like to be described or addressed or how they would describe themselves. So I'm like, oh, okay, great. Like that. I mean, that's helpful. And also now I don't have to feel bad if I'm person first or identity first when I can just kind of muddle through and figure it out as I go. If I'm talking to a human that, that I can sort it out. Like, it's not like you're not wrong necessarily, unless someone tells you which way they like to be addressed and you like decide to be stupid about it.
Right. And yeah, I think that's so much about what the book is so great about is that like, just be human, right? Just make the mistakes, apologize for the mistakes, learn from the mistakes. And you said something else in there that I wanted to address too. But yeah, that was the person first thing. Yeah, I mean, it was for a while. Person first was so important.
That was aggressive for a little bit.
First, yeah, and it's so interesting to hear. Like, basically, what so much of the book is. I was going to say anything goes, but that's not true.
No,
so many words.
No list. Yeah,
so many words, so many things we do not say or should not say. But just that, as long as you're coming again from a place of empathy, curiosity, and respect, and you're speaking with kindness, then if you screw up and you apologize and you move on. And it was huge for me too. Like the word disability has the word dis in it. Like, that's negative. How do you even start a conversation with that? And yet she embraces that word, and the disability community does too. So as far as we hear from, through her interpretation, again, I would imagine is very individual, right? We have to be very careful about how we talk to people about these things. And I think it's so much of like, it goes back to pronouns, to everything. And I have to, because every conversation I have has to somehow talk about fuck the patriarchy and anti-capitalism. But I think
bring it on.
right? Goes back to the colonialist, patriarchal approach to any kind of interaction, right? Which is the assumption that there's a lot of sort of superiority, there's a lot of polite implications and so on. So you do not ask questions, you don't express curiosity, you do not, you make assumptions because that's what we do. So I think it's so interesting to be sort of, I have this image of like going underneath the concrete and throwing it up in the air and saying, that's not how we do things anymore. We talk to each other. Like, what a concept.
What? Yeah.
Right? We communicate.
Yeah.
I think that's so much of what I got from this book too.
Yeah, it was so great. And just a few things on the what not to say list, just around the word disability. She's like, disability, yes, just say it. Here's some, and she really doesn't like the euphemisms for disability because basically they are undercutting a sense of identity that people have that is very real and very lived. And so she's like, differently abled, no. Handy capable, absolute no. Like, and also handicapped is not cool anymore. That was, I think, an older terminology, not in the modern world. It's just disabled. Disability, disabled are the words. So I think, get specific for specific people. But I think we try to, again, like that, what you were saying about be polite and be like, oh, well, it's not that bad. Let's just, make it feel nicer, make ourselves feel better about something that maybe we think is supposed to feel bad. And so we're going to call it something kind of nice and like kind of elevate things in a weird way that takes off the edges that are actually challenging or difficult or just normal and assumed. And we're like, oh, that must be challenging and difficult. Like it puts on a layer of assumption that then we have to like fix our layer of assumption in terms of how we address people, which seems like a lot of work actually, but also not super engaging, like you were just saying, like it doesn't actually engage the person and how they operate and see themselves in the world. So yeah, we don't need to be polite about it. Just say disability, move on. And exactly what you said. You screw up, someone corrects you, great, take it in, apologize, keep moving.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think too, like I was going, again, it's been so fun preparing for this because it really made me think more deeply about stuff. But one of the things I was thinking about is like disability has been seen as the disability community has been seen as a marginal community, a minority, when in fact, I think as we start to incorporate neurodivergence and anything else, like I was thinking, I wear glasses. I just started wearing glasses about 5 years ago. They're just readers, they're magnifiers. And that has become a disability because if I don't have, I have a 17-year-old daughter who's constantly on her phone and she's like, Mama, look at this. And I have to where are my glasses? I have to get my glasses. And so I have to accommodate myself. And that is, I've completely lost my train of thought. ADHD is
disabilities everywhere. That's yeah.
Yeah, right. 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 So the disability community is not the minority. It is probably the majority. And I would say, I don't even know. There's neurotypical, normal, able-bodied, whatever. The person who doesn't have any disability is such a tiny percentage, and yet the world has been developed for them. And again, we'll go back to patriarchy and capitalism. That tiny minority has had this massive privilege where I'm really excited to see it flip. And that made me want to ask you if you've heard of a podcast called From What If to What Next?
I'm not sure. No, I haven't.
Super cool podcast. So the host just posits great things. There's one I want to share with you about what if there was an alternative to capitalism after all.
Oh, a favorite topic.
Right? So he brings in guests to talk about it. And there was one he had about what if the Black fantastic reshaped the world? So what if rather than white culture dominating, Black culture had dominated? Mm-hmm. And I think what if the world were created, or any society were created around the accommodations and accessibility of all, and how what a totally different world it would be. And this helped me start to think along those lines too.
Yeah, I think there was a sort of interesting part of the book about adding accessibility. And I think she was really speaking to physical accessibility to spaces, because she wrote a lot. She talks a lot about her personal experience being in she has a large mobility device that is motorized, is my impression. And so it's big, it's heavy. It does not do stairs, broadly speaking, and she has to get around, do things or whatever. And I feel like she has this conversation over and over. People are like, oh, we know we don't need to be accessible to people with mobility devices because we don't have anyone here who needs a mobility device. Like this very circular reasoning, right? And like
Right.
she points out, well, if someone in a mobility device can't even get in the door to interview with you, of course you're never going to have anyone with a mobility device work in this organization because they literally cannot get in the door. Like,
Yeah.
okay, I guess that's maybe why you don't have any here. Like it's, again, like this other circle of, well, of course you're not going to have these folks present in your space. Like you are not accommodating them, so they're never going to be here. And they're like, well, we don't have them, so we don't need to accommodate them. Like it's these two very opposite, very weird arguments that fundamentally, don't make any sense.
The cognitive dissonance is powerful there. Yeah. And I think that's another, that accessibility thing. She does talk largely about physical accommodations. Her wheelchair is a great story, or her mobility device. I think I just made one of those mistakes that I knew I would make. She has talked a lot. I think as she and I were starting to connect, her story sort of blew up because she was on a flight and most airplanes cannot accommodate these mobility devices. So a person who uses them is forced to leave their comfort of their own mobility device, which typically weighs several hundred pounds and costs tens of thousands of dollars. That thing is then thrown into the luggage compartment, like literally, and then yanked out of it at the end of the flight, where the person who uses that needs to then be, accommodated, moved in and out of a seat and a temporary wheelchair and things. Like it's just disastrous. And then so that happened, and then she got to her chair and it was destroyed. People were hanging off, like the electronics were completely broken, and there was not even an apology. So she was all over the news with that and stuff. And that's certainly, I've heard that story from so many people who use devices. So there's a great story of accommodation there. Like, why can't there be space on an airplane that allows people to sit in their own devices?
Right. I know that happens in buses here. Like they have the seats that fold up on the bus so that a mobility device can fit there and even get strapped in if needed, and, whatever, depending on the device. Very different on an airplane, I'm sure. But apparently very different on an airplane. I was super, a part of the book that I really enjoyed that really made me think a lot was this differentiation that I have found super common between high functioning and low functioning. Like that terminology, which she's like, hey, that's actually not cool. I'm like, oh no, because I feel like in my world, coming from the world of education, that is super common to say, oh, this is a very high functioning person. This is, very low functioning person. And here's basically she's quoting Noor Perez, another person who says low functioning that word is used to deny agency to disabled people who have high support needs, while high functioning is used to deny resources to people who can mask their disability well. I'm like, oh, you're right. Like, dang it. And we of the able-bodied, neurotypical enough-ish world are like, wait, but we can label people and then we can, they're high functioning. I don't need to help them. Or like, oh wait, they're low functioning. Apparently they can't do anything for themselves. I'm like, that is 100% true how that plays out. And it really is about support needs versus masking. I'm like, yeah, I see now why this is a little bit crappy when in my world, I'm like, this is super common. This is typical. This is normal. Like this is how you do it, right? Not actually awesome. So a little like my brain exploded a tiny bit at that part.
Yeah, me too. And I think that brings to mind a couple of things I wanted to bring up. One is there's a great commercial that I saw. I don't know if you've seen it yet about it's Down syndrome. It's a wonderful commercial. I'll share. I don't know if you do links that you share.
Yeah, I'll put it in the show notes for sure. You can share it with me. Yeah.
I'm just looking for my notes about it and I can't find them, but basically it's, that concept that whatever we assume of somebody is exactly what they're capable of. If I assume that you can't go to a nightclub and drink and dance, then you can't. If I assume that you can't do a job, then you can't. If I as a person of privilege and power, assume that. So and then also and that like that's high functioning low, that refers to high functioning low functioning.
Yeah.
That was like why that was a challenge for me too, the high functioning low functioning. My daughter and I have been watching Love on the Spectrum. Have you seen that show?
Oh, I have seen it. That is
Right. So
a wild show. Yeah.
autistic people or people with autism, depending on their preference,
Yeah.
date.
Yeah.
And it's
And you
really
see how they're living and their lives, like where they're living, what they do, how they're recreating. It was the folks on the show, it's basically reality TV following around the love lives of folks with spectrum disabilities of various sorts, I think.
Yeah. What do we say? Disorder spectrum? I don't know. Is it a spectrum? I think we don't even, my understanding is that we don't even use a spectrum anymore.
Oh, well.
It goes back to high functioning, low functioning, right? It goes back to the same thing. So language is ever changing. We learn and learn. But I find the show so interesting because I identify as having autism. I can't get a diagnosis because my doctor doesn't think it serves people with the stigma attached to autism to get a diagnosis, which is so interesting. That's a whole other topic unto itself. But watching this show, parts of me are like, yeah, I totally identify, and other parts are like, haha, that's so funny. What a quirky individual. And I just wonder, I wonder how much of that is bias, prejudice, privilege, how much of it is the manipulation of the show makers who are trying to get those reactions from people and sort of these people as oddities. So
and I think there's this part, the oddity, like, oh, this is a spectacle. Like, it's weird. I think I watched maybe an episode or two of the show, and I didn't, I'm like, I don't, okay, I'm not actually a big show watcher person, but I think there's this other side of like, oh, I'm sort of just watching this quote unquote weird little oddity, I think. And the flip side of that is Emily Ladau talks about disability porn. I'm like, oh, these people are so inspirational. Like, oh my gosh. And that is also, again, not cool. I don't think she actually uses the word not cool, but this is my interpretation. She's like, hey, like you thinking that you're seeing someone doing something that is so quotey inspirational because you actually pity the person. So it is actually inspiring pity in someone because you're actually assuming that everything is terrible for them all the time. And like, whoo, good thing that's not me. I'm like, okay, that's actually not an awesome cycle of thought process when you approach folks with disabilities.
There's so much that you said there. Yeah, I think she does actually say not cool a few times in the book.
Oh, good.
Part of what I love about the book is that it is so conversational. Yeah. It is so not judgy. It is so not preachy. I
listened to the audiobook, by the way, and she reads the audiobook herself. So I think, anyways, just cool. It's very fun. I always love when authors read their own books, by the way. Anyway, carry on.
She had one quote that I've highlighted, which was, my goal isn't to put you to sleep. It's to invite you to feel the rhythmic drumbeat of movement toward disability rights and autonomy, which I love. And that's probably one of the wordiest sentences in the whole book. Like it's even like the book itself it's physically accessible. It's nice,
pretty slim.
Book. Yeah, the type is, in the physical book, the type is large. The paper is really nice, actually. My copy, as you can see, is very well thumbed.
Yes, marked. It's like 4,000 like dog-eared corners in that. So good job.
Pencils, Post-its, the whole thing. You said so many other things that I wanted to grab in there, but I lost my train of thought. I'm presenting a very accurate representation of ADHD and neurodivergence. So,
well, I don't know represent. If I could just dump in a few more ideas at any given moment. I was talking about disability porn and also the pitying cycle that the reality that is that like is supposed to actually invokes pity. And as someone, I know a friend who has a child with Down syndrome and like hates to no end the head of the football team invited the disabled kid to prom, that story. Wow. Every time she's like, this is disgusting. Like she'll just post about it. I'm like, yeah, it is kind of gross. You're right. Yeah.
The porn part. Yeah. So there's the other part of that. And in fact, a similar part of that is P.T. Barnum. And she refers to him finding the freaks, quote unquote, and charging people to see them. And where the M word comes from is from midges, which are tiny bugs that we're seen as entertaining and performing. And so that whole that whole culture is pretty awful. And in fact, the commercial that I will put in show notes and I'm really excited to show you talks about what is it? Yeah, our negative assumptions about people with Down syndrome can lead us to treat them in such a way that these assumptions become reality. In sociology, this is called the self-fulfilling prophecies. I'm sure you've heard that. Yes,
right.
But I'll also give you an article that that was published about this commercial and people reacting to it, and it was so interesting because a lot of people are like, "Oh, geez, I'm really guilty of that," and then some people are like, "Oh, she's so cute! Isn't she just adorable?"
Like infantilizing someone.
Right? People with Down syndrome are so cute and adorable, and they're just such generally good people. Like, no, there's probably some people with Down syndrome who are just assholes.
Yeah.
So those assumptions that we make because people with Down syndrome have very baby-like faces and childlike demeanor sometimes, and so we assume that, oh, they're delightful, sweet people, and they're so cute. And that's something too that my daughter and I found, or Lily, I found my daughter doing with the people with autism and on the spectrum, Love on Spectrum. She was like, oh, she's so cute when she does that. And I just find that we infantilize in so many ways when somebody doesn't think or do or speak the way we do.
Yeah. Yeah. Versus like, wow, that's an awkward conversation. That was, I think that whole show for me was like, ooh,
that's super awkward.
That's like, oh, and they just keep going. You're like, yeah, it is a lot of awkward conversations and very, a fun mix. Clearly the show they picked, like the people are casted, like, whatever any reality TV, like they find the people they wanted and, to do the things or to be, highlighted. So yeah, it's a fascinating show and definitely in one way a look into a world that is not a part of my world at all. Like, oh, this is when you talk about invisible disability or people like not having access or seeing. Great, here's this image of what this world is like for some people. For a few people who happen to be on the show in of this certain type, probably chosen because they actually really engage in awkward conversation pretty frequently. That makes really great TV and whatever, it's episodic, and at the same time, I don't think, that does lead to this possibility of being like, oh, they're so funny. Like, oh, it's them. Yeah,
there's
exactly.
Separation. Yeah. I would say that the second season, and because I'm not, this is probably the only reality TV I ever watch. I do not watch as a rule, not as a rule, but as in general.
Just as a mental health process. Yeah.
Right? Yes, exactly. But the second season is much better with having people who are, who are less, what am I saying? I was going to go to the high functioning, low functioning,
right?
That, who are maybe less obviously autistic as we understand it. And they actually have some queer stories too, which is kind of refreshing, and some people of color. What a concept.
What? Oh yeah. And Emily talks about this in the book. There are so many intersecting identities that give a lot of different perspective to what disability means in the context of someone's life. And obviously, the more different factors that are involved, you are going to have a lot of, this is why you can't treat everyone the same. Like, no great news flash there. But I think adding a layer of disability in a world that is not designed for disability, like amplifies and like really puts a lot more limits on folks than maybe I would always assume or recognize, or like, just cruising around being like, oh, I guess, this building doesn't, the obvious, this building doesn't have a ramp, weird. Or, well, I wouldn't notice if the sign lettering was too small to read. Like, oh, I can read that sign just fine. I happen to have vision that can like process that one, when that's maybe not accessible to people. Or like, oh, this, all the crosswalks where I live have audio cues now. Like they'll tell you that you can cross the street, and they'll tell you which street you can cross because, it could be either direction theoretically that you're going at a crosswalk. And I'm like, well, you still have to know what street you're facing for that to work, that if you're crossing the street versus that street. So it's interesting to see these things become more present and more common, but I don't even know if I don't know how much I'm missing.
Right. That's a really good point. And I think too, you live in Portland, correct?
Right. Yeah. Portland, Oregon.
yeah, fairly progressive city. And I would argue that most cities don't have those kinds of accommodations, even those, my city doesn't have any of those accommodations. There's no chirping, no sorts of things. And that brings me up to another thing that Emily talks about in the book about how, and I've seen this too, again, in the people I follow on Twitter and such, that this sort of weird impulse of people to want to help, again, in their point of privilege, like I can see and I can walk, and therefore I am, better than you, and therefore here I can come in and save you and do something for you. And I hear so many stories of people, like being forced to cross the street they weren't wanting to cross.
Oh no. Well, yeah, and she specifically says my mobility device is part of my body. You would never grab someone else's body and just push them around. Don't touch me. Like as a stranger, obviously we're talking about blah, blah, blah. Like, who cares? But if I don't know you or what you're doing, don't touch me. Don't touch anyone, like fundamentally. But the idea that this is, in her mind, this is my body, like, is this whole device. And I think she someplace mentions that her mobility device is weighs like 400 pounds. Like, it must not be very, it's not a teeny hidden little thing. It is very, my impression, very big, very obvious. I think she said it was purple at some point. Like, it sounds kind of amazing. But yeah, I can just imagine. And I think she mentioned the story of like, someone's like, oh, let me help you up that ramp, and just starts pushing her. Like, who would you, if someone was walking in front of you, would you just push them up a ramp?
Right.
Or like, she was, not.
It goes back to that sort of infantilizing and othering, right?
Clearly you need help. Clearly you can't do this on your own. Clearly,
And I, being a privileged person who I know that can help you.
Let me save you. It brings it makes it a little gross for sure. Were there other parts of the book that caught your eye that seemed really interesting to you?
So many, and
right.
Like, I think there are so many quick little reference tools I thought were really great in it. Like, as you said, that, say this, don't say this, it was really, really helpful. And I was going to suggest that, like, people take pictures of that and keep that on their phone. Well, maybe, if you don't have a phone or you can't see very well or whatever, but there are any number of different ways that you could probably keep those handy.
Yeah.
And I found that, like, to me, the book sort of feels like you can pick it up at any point and read a couple of pages and learn something really great.
Yeah, It is very much packed with information. I mean, although she uses her stories about herself to sort of describe the situations to sort of lead into the chapters, but even those you get the understanding of what this looks like in practice. You're like, oh, someone trying to push. Who would I push up a ramp? Weird. Like, she makes it super human and super real, and then talks about what this actually means and why this is important and stuff like that. So it is, there's not fluff, I guess I should say, in this book, which I also really appreciated.
Yeah, it's pretty fluffless. Yes, I would say fluff free. Yeah, and I did, honestly, again, with ADHD, I haven't finished the book. I've owned this for a couple of years, and I keep trying to get there. And I'm looking now, there's disability in the media, sounds really interesting. Certainly calling out and calling in ableism. It sounds like something I really want to read and haven't read yet.
Yeah. And it's still, I think the book is maybe 120 pages. It's not a hefty, like, guidebook. It is a slim, here's what to do, here's what you can do. I mean, it is super well titled, like, here it is. Let me just tell you the things and why, a little bit about why they matter. It's not a sociological study. It's not a, case study of 1,000 things. She provides herself as an example and other folks as examples at times, but it really is all directed toward that, how to be an ally. Like, how are you going to act in support because of this? Here's some information. Here's what you need to do about it. Here's what you can do right now. Here's some ideas. Here's some actions you can take. I really like that was oriented toward taking action and not freaking out about screwing it up along the way.
Yeah.
Just keep taking action.
And the action that you take can be so simple. Like, it just comes down to just talking, right? Just communicating. And I'm looking in the back, there's tons of pages and pages of resources, which is cool. Something else. I'm trying to figure out where I got this from in the book. I'm looking at my notes, but the way we think and talk about it shapes how other people think and talk about it. So I think, like, normalizing the conversation about disability is so important. So not being afraid to talk about it, not being afraid to make those little mistakes, not being afraid to offend. like even talking about not knowing how to talk about can change that dialogue can change the whole conversation. So I think that's something I really got from this book too, is that it's like took away the fear around making the mistakes and took away all the fear around interacting. Well, that was another thing is like she was talking about don't stare but don't look away.
Right.
That's something I really struggle with. And it's something like I struggle with so many people. I live in a small, extremely white, extremely privileged town and with a lot of tourism. And the tourists tend to be white and privileged. And so when I see somebody, like when I see people of color, when I see people, queer people holding hands, when I see people with wicked tattoos, I want to say like, yes, or when I see disabled people in the disability community, I want to like acknowledge them. But how do I do that without like being weird or pejorative or condescending or icky,
Yeah, right. When someone's like, just let me have my picnic, like get out of my grill. Yeah, it is. And she doesn't give you a clear answer, right? There's no clear answer to this. But she does
because
talk
it's
about
individual, I think, right? It's totally.
Yeah. There's this great part though about where she talks about kids who are more willing to ask the question and more willing to say the thing. And the parent who's like, oh my God, the kid said the thing,
Yeah.
And I feel like she tells a story about how she's cruising around somewhere. A kid's like, "Oh my gosh, are her legs broken?" Or like kind of asks like kind of a like not kind of a weird question. And the mom's like, "Don't ever say that." And she's more worried about the mom's reaction. That the mom is saying, "We never talk about this. We don't blah blah blah." Versus, I think she tells another story about a similar situation. Someone a kid asks kind of a awkward ability question, and the mom's like, "Hey, I think we need to frame that in a way that recognizes, this is not how the mom says it because they speak to a child like a child, but like, let's reframe that so that we're coming from kindness, essentially, it's sort of like the frame for the kid asking the question. And like, maybe let's ask if this person wants a question about this. And I think being who she is, she's like, yes, ask me questions, like she was down for that. So basically the mom is coaching the kid to approach a person with compassion and kindness versus judgment and assumption, right? And I think how the parents in both of those situations reacted tells you a lot about how that kid is going to view disability in the future, right? Without like your training reactions, your training behavior in that response to a question that might be a little, obviously for both moms was like, ooh, okay, like a little cringy, if nothing else, whatever the question was that the kid was asking. And like Emily would say, like, yeah, those 6-year-old questions are fine. Like those are actually okay with me. Like, and she obviously speaks for herself and not everyone ever in the world of disability. But I think the story that if you approach folks with kindness and compassion and not assume, and I think we have so many layers of assumption, like the backstory is we come in with so many layers of assumption that we don't even know, that to come in without assumption and with compassion is actually tricky at times. And do your best, people. Like, I think that's the end. It's like this, like, kind of like, do your best. I believe in you, kind of like vibe, but like, here's some things to be aware of everything and do your best.
Well, that's so true. And I like that whole idea of, constantly checking your own bias, right? Is this from me? Is this societal? Is this my real belief? Is this true? All those sorts of things. When she talks about kids, she also talks about some of the wildly inappropriate things that adults say. Like, how fast does that thing go? Or, ooh, don't run over me with that thing,
Yeah. And she's like, I've heard it all. I'm like, I know, I bet you have. Like, oh, sorry. I feel sorry for you already. Knowing that every other person is like, oh, that you must just tear it up at the track. And she's like, oh, good. Okay, dummy. Like, again. I mean, that's the vibe I get from her. I do not know her, but I suspect there's this very much an eye-rolly part of her personality. I think maybe it's just me interpreting this kind of like, okay, another one of you. Ding-a-ling's going to talk about how fast my chair goes. Like, okay.
Yeah, for sure. And now to you, I'm curious about with your experience in education, what are your thoughts on how this could be applied? Like that, when I was reading this, I was thinking this should be in every school. It should be in every library. It should be in everything, like school from grade, I don't know what, 5, 1 or whatever up.
Yeah.
Like this should be a manual everybody has. Yeah,
it's super accessible. I think,
so to speak.
What was that?
So to speak.
Yeah, right. Exactly. I think I mean, I would love to see more folks in educational roles being more aware and being able to interrupt places of like ability porn, and being able to interrupt like the really the uncool aspects of judgment that come into those conversations. I don't have a grand plan. Sorry. I think I agree though. More people reading this book, I think, would make the world a better place. And I think there's also this part where things will evolve and things will change. And this is great. I think it was written fairly recently, so it's not a very old book, maybe 5 or 6 years old at the most.
2020 or
there you go.
Yeah.
And I know things will evolve and change, but I think this idea of demystifying is really the key. Like, because people freak out. They're like, this is this weird thing I'm freaking out about. And the what to know and what to say are great places to start. The how to be an ally is the next step. And
right.
I think
really good point.
But also that mystification is a nice way of saying the judgment around disability. Like, quit being judgy about disability would be the like snarkier like way to title this book.
Right.
But I think to demystify is really an approachable. I mean, her whole goal is to be approachable and to like draw people in, and this book really does draw people in. So, the more folks get their hands on this book, I think the better.
I agree. Yeah. It is my goal to buy cases and cases of it and just stand on street corners.
You could do worse things. You could do worse things for sure. Well, we do need to wrap up this episode. It's been awesome talking with you, Lauren. Any last? I mean, I know pressure's on. Last like hot tip. You're like, wait, this one thing I must say. I must. No,
that esprit de l'escalier will come to me later, I'm sure. Like tonight at 4 a.m. when I can't say, oh, why didn't I say? But I think again, like my whole thing of curiosity, empathy, and respect. You can't go wrong with those things, and I think that's part of what I learned from this book.
Yes, excellent, great words to end on. Thanks so much for chatting with me today.
Thank you so much, Aggie. This has been a real joy. Thanks.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Books Applied podcast. I hope you enjoyed getting to know a new book and learning how to apply its ideas to make your work, sport, or life a little bit more awesome. For more leadership education related content, including conflict management checklists, invitations to a fun free lunch that happens monthly, upcoming classes, webinars, and mastermind groups, please head over to wslleadership.com. Thanks, and have a great day.